So it looks like it's finally actually going to happen, that Elon Musk is going to acquire Twitter. It's in the works right now. Don't know the exact closing date, but essentially should be closing anytime soon. So I'm going to go through kind of the structure of the transaction itself, just to explain a little bit about how it happens structurally and legally, and what the result will be. So let me share my screen and show you a little bit about the transaction. So essentially back in April is when this all started, and eventually there was an agreement and plan of merger dated April 25th of this year, 2022. Here's a copy that was filed with the SEC. That's about 89 pages or so, somewhere along that line. And basically this outlines the entire transaction, how it's going to be acquired. This is a type of acquisition that's structured as a technical merger. The term for it is a reverse triangular merger, and I'll show you what that means in just a second. But essentially this sets out all the legal terms. This is basically a contract between the company and Elon and a variety of different parties on exactly how it's going to happen. And once all of the closing conditions, meaning the things required in order for them to finalize the acquisition, once those occur, within about 2 business days after all those are done is when it technically closes and then moves forward. So this kind of outlines, here's all the definitions, but this outlines the basics of the merger in Article 2, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, and what effect it has on the stock of all the different companies and how the money gets paid out. So essentially, it's basically to buy out all of the stock of Twitter, and basically for approximately $54 per share, $54.20 per share is what the offer was. And that's the way that the transaction is structured. Let me show you. First, the board of directors of Twitter had to approve the transaction. For a while, they, tried to stall and tried to delay and tried to, avoid the transaction if they could, but knowing that there's potentially claims for breach of fiduciary duty against the board members because the value at the time was on the higher side, that they were facing potential lawsuits probably if they didn't approve it. So eventually the board of directors approved the transaction. Then here is a copy of what's called an 8K. It's filed with the SEC and basically announces things that happen with a public company. So in April, it talks about the entry into the agreement. And then in July, they submitted this to stockholders to vote on the actual acquisition to approve it. And as you can see, 453 million approximately voted to approve, about 4 million voted against it. So it was approved by the stockholders. And that means that they had basically the approval on the corporate level to move forward. So let me show you how it's structured. Let me switch screens here and I can show you essentially the way that it is structured. So here we have, okay, so this is the Twitter acquisition. It's a reverse triangular merger. So over on the right, we have the shareholders that own common stock, just a little under 500 million shares, that was traded on the New York Stock Exchange of Twitter, of the Twitter Corporation, a Delaware corporation. That meant that the shareholders of common stock were the owners of Twitter. So that's how it is from the start. Elon is up here. He created these new companies. X Holdings 1, a Delaware corporation, which is considered a parent in the merger agreement. X Holdings 2, which is another Delaware corporation, and that's the acquisition sub. And this is pretty standard for a reverse triangular merger form of an acquisition. So the first thing that happens once all the approvals are in and it's ready to close, first parent over here pays cash, pays the $54.20 to all the shareholders of common stock. They turn in their stock and basically get the cash, $54 a share. The Twitter stock then goes over, and it's basically being bought, excuse me, by the parent. And this all happens essentially simultaneously from a legal perspective. So Twitter stock goes over. As soon as the parent receives the stock, it is essentially canceled or voided, and it's no longer valid. So these publicly traded shares on the New York Stock Exchange are then purchased. Those public shares are canceled, and they're no longer outstanding for the company. Yeah. Part of the same transaction is step 2, where upon basically acquiring all the stock of Twitter, Acquisition Sub, which is wholly owned by this company here, parent, sorry, go back, merges into Twitter. So Acquisition Sub merges with Twitter Inc., the current company, with Twitter remaining as the surviving corporation under Delaware law. So that means essentially Twitter remains, Acquisition Sub disappears and merges into Twitter and basically disappears. And so now Twitter takes the place of Acquisition Sub and is now 100% owned by the parent, which is owned by Elon Musk, or however he has that structured. We don't know the ownership of that. So that's the end result. Essentially, now Musk owns the parent company that owns 100% of Twitter. That means that Twitter would then be a private company, no longer subject to some of the public reporting company obligations. So in terms of filing financial reports and filing notices of things that happen with the company with an 8K, those are usually no longer required. So we may or may not learn a lot about what's going on. Basically, once a company goes private, it becomes a lot more confidential in terms of what's going on with the company, the financials, because publicly traded companies have obligations to file all these reports to make sure investors who are buying their stock off the New York Stock Exchange are fully informed and protected so that they know what they're buying. So now that it's public, or once it becomes private, then it no longer has some of those same obligations. So we may not know as much about what's going on with the company. Elon doesn't have to report to a bunch of stockholders. He puts his own board of directors in, and he has general obligations to the company and certain fiduciary duties of the corporation, but he doesn't have to report to a bunch of stockholders or other board. He basically puts in whoever he wants, takes whatever steps he wants in terms of eliminating staff or whatever he's going to do. So that is the end result of the reverse triangular merger, and so we'll see where it goes from here. Thanks for watching.